spent a lot of time with James Baldwin's work, particularly as an undergraduate. So I'm excited to.
Did he pause for you guys?
Oh dear. I think he's back.
Oh, did you lose me?
Yes, sorry, we lost him.
Sorry about that.
Yeah, you're back.
Where did you lose me?
I think you were talking about James Baldwin's writings.
Okay, yeah. So I've had some experience with James Baldwin, particularly as an undergraduate. And I thought we could start the discussion by just going around, and I'm curious what's on your mind after watching the documentary this evening. Why don't we start with Zakiya?
So I actually watched the documentary sometime during quarantine, and I watched it just now, like an hour before. Both times, I can truly say that the documentary is really impactful because I don't know, like the documentary kind of just put into perspective some thinking that I don't usually do, and like being a Black student and being a Black woman in America. James Baldwin brought up a lot of like ideas to really think about on how we need to transition into a better change for America. And yeah, like I mean, it still just kind of sits heavy with my mental.
Christian. Thanks.
Yeah, so I think this is either my fourth or fifth time watching the film, because I remember my first time I watched it in, I think, my race and ethnicity class last year when I was a sophomore. But I really liked the film. It was very impactful, like Zakiya said. I really like how they use visuals while also telling the story of America. And one of the main takeaways I got was how vicious American racism is, especially when it comes to Black radical leaders trying to dismantle like the institutions and the systems of oppression in society. It's like very vicious and violent whenever we try to like solve racism. And that's something we should probably be thinking about, especially right now with all the protests going on around the country. So yeah, it was a good film.
Thanks. Sydney?
This was actually my first time watching this documentary. I have some degree of familiarity with Baldwin's written works. I actually reread some of them over the past week in preparation for this. So I reread The Devil All the Time, which some excerpts of that are actually incorporated into the script for this. And I read a few of his other fictional works as well. And I think this documentary does an incredible job of translating the emotion behind those works and the aims of those works, transposing that and providing all of this evidence and historical footage. I think it really admirably takes this text source and expounds upon it in some really skillful and profound ways.
Thanks. Jasmine, can I ask you as well, even though you're the host?
Yeah, this film was so powerful for me. This was my second time watching it, and it was an introduction. The first time I wasn't really familiar with James Baldwin's work, but I thought that it was really great in kind of introducing him and like his psyche and having us understand where he was coming from. And I think that this film kind of proves as relevant today, especially in the time of, you know, all of this social unrest and the Black Lives Matter movement. it just seems more relevant than ever, even though it kind of points to historical pieces of media and like shows us um, kind of like racist images in the past. It kind of tells us that, you know, it's not just about the past, it still is occurring today. And that's why the film is so powerful for me.
Thanks. Were there any particular scenes that stuck out to y'all?
I
And
guess
I'll
I
just,
can enter in.
yeah,
But
no, I was going to say, I just opened it up to you. Yep.
okay. So I know there are actually many scenes I found to be like super impactful and just so powerful in this film. I know the scenes of the integration when it's like the black students trying to integrate into the schools and all these crowds of white people just being so violent and screaming at them. It's very sobering to look at, especially like now, because that's actually why I liked how they used color in most of the visuals, because it makes it doesn't seem that's that far away. Because I notice sometimes when people try to use the civil rights pictures in like black and white, it kind of has a tone of, oh, that was very far away. We are completely past that kind of overt racism, or we're no longer like racist or anything like that. And like the use of like color kind of pushes back against that idea that we're still dealing with racism, even if it's sometimes covert or overt, and it's still a problem that needs to be addressed continually until it's like fixed, or until the systems keeping that alive or gotten rid of. So
If I can,
Other scenes?
if I can jump in, you have to forgive me. I was taking notes on my phone, so I think probably there were two particular segments of this film that really stood out to me. The first being the discussion between Baldwin and the professor of philosophy, whose name escapes me, but who the professor made the argument, you know, well, why do we have to see race? Why do you keep categorizing people like this? And it's such a grating thing to hear, and you hear it so much nowadays, and it's like, okay, great, if you want to go through your life telling yourself that you don't treat people any differently because of their race, fine, tell yourself whatever you want, but you're ignoring the fact that the entire country is built on this institution of oppression. And by saying, oh, well, let's just not worry about race anymore, you're ignoring those problems to make yourself feel better. And I think Baldwin did a really good job of just crushing that argument. And I guess sort of in the same vein, the other scene that really stood out to me was the segment where they displayed part of the propaganda film. I believe it was called Land That We Love, or Land That I Love, where it's sort of, you know, expounding on the virtues of America and the freedoms, and, oh, look at the amusement parks and the happy people. And, you know, then about halfway through, they start interspersing it with these scenes of police violence and the brutality of the American system. Because again, for all of the land of the free talk, it is a land built on this system of oppression that white people will ignore or sort of brush aside to make themselves feel better.
To elaborate on what Sydney and Christian were also talking about, I feel like the closing scene was probably the most impactful, because he addresses, like, I'm a man and you're a man, you consider yourself a man as well. So what is the purpose of having a Negro? Like what is the purpose in distinguishing my being from yours? I mean, the identity of that idea is very impactful for me. And a little bit further into the documentary, where they addressed like white America and how it's very naive and just kind of irresponsible and just happy. And I think it's interesting how basically everybody in America, we find a way to adapt to being that type of happy, regardless of wanting to not tap into the. Okay, sorry, there was like a chat that popped up, but yeah, where white America would rather be happy rather than tapping into the inner terror of Black America.
Christian, on that topic of scenes, and you've seen this, you said 4 or 5 times. How much has it changed? Because they incorporate images from protests this summer. Do you have a sense of how much the film has changed since the incorporation of those images? Is it substantially different, or is it just that those couple scenes at the beginning?
Well, in terms of like the climate, like right now, I would say, I feel like there is some overlap, especially when we have seen like some of the protests at the beginning in May, when it comes to like Minnesota or like Louisville, for instance, because there are like some similarities with those two in particular, and like Ferguson. And I feel like there is a lot of similarities in my opinion, but I see a lot of similarities from like some of the beginning scenes in the movie to like what we're seeing today. So
let's talk a little bit about the title of the film. And I'm wondering if your impression of that title changed from when you first read it to having watched the documentary and thought more about its title and how that relates to the presentation of material in it.
So I can jump in. So for the title, whenever I like looked at it first, it's very striking. Like especially, I am not your Negro. The emphasis on your especially, because I see it as like a power relation being contested. Like we're both on like equal footing. You're not better than me. We're both on equal footing, and you will not take my power away from me. And I feel like with that title, it kind of is like similar to the film where it talks about like American racism, but we are also like fighting for equality. So the title kind of pushes this relationship of I own you to like, no, we're both on the same footing. We're both equal. We do not own each other. We're both equal in society. So that's how I saw the title of the film.
Yeah, I definitely agree with Christian. I love the use of the word your. There is that sense of reclaiming, I guess, that sort of power and the individuality. And, you know, there's also this idea of I am not what you want to make me. I am what I choose to be, not what you choose for me. And I think throughout the film that sentiment is carried.
It looks like we have a great question from the chat about the use of editing throughout the documentary. and the relationship between some of the abrupt transitions and the music and the kind of background noise and the way that that contributed to the message of the documentary. Did that occur to anybody, or anybody want to talk about that?
Yeah, I'll talk about it. I noted that it had, when on like certain scenes, it would have like a whimsical, kind of like carefree vibe, and it was kind of like, uh, yeah, I mean, it was kind of like a whimsical notion of how America is in relation to how other countries see them. But most of the foundation of America is the brutal conception of Black America. And like James Baldwin was saying, America is built from Black America. And so it's just kind of like an ironic sense of this whimsical front stage idea, but you have this dark hidden backstage identity.
Yeah, I would also add that in some of like the death scenes, when it comes to like either when Baldwin is finding out what happened to either Malcolm or Martin Luther King Jr. or Medgar, I noticed that the music is kind of somberish, or it's not like in your face. It's very somber, and it kind of like sets the tone of like, oh, this is not good, or like this is like some kind of loss of hope in like the death of a Black leader. And that was like one instance where the music is kind of like very somber. And then in like some other scenes, especially, I think there's this one scene where Baldwin was talking to this one person while it cut back to like people protesting. And I feel like when it comes to like, when it's used in that manner, it's like a juxtaposition to kind of like emphasize the message of like American racism and how violent it is when it comes to people protesting, especially when we see like it happening with cops brutalizing protesters.
On that note, I think one other thing that the editing here does, it gives you a bit of time to recover and time to build up between the very intense or emotional points, which I'm both grateful for as a viewer and appreciative of as a critic, that it if it were, I think, point after point after point of this very high emotion and very high intensity, it kind of loses that intensity as you carry on, because it's impossible to keep that level of intensity with that level of interest throughout the film. So it chooses very deliberately at what points, I say the director chooses very deliberately at what points this real intensity is going to come about, and then gives you a bit of a lull in which to consider and recover, and then begins to build up to the next thing. And I think that's very well executed here.
Seems to me as well that the narration from Samuel L. Jackson, which is very direct and monotone, is a through line, right? That kind of works with the way that it then moves in and out of intense scenes or poignant moments. It's sort of always there as a background. A couple folks mentioned this in opening comments about the use of popular media and the incorporation of popular films from, it seems like, mid-century, 60s, 50s, 60s, 70s, a couple older films as well, 30s and 40s. What did y'all make of the inclusion of popular media interspersing with the commentary and the use of newsreels. So I'm thinking here about the movies that are incorporated.
I mean, film. Oh, I'm sorry. Did you want to go? You can. Okay. I think film media is one of the best reflections of reality that we have. It carries, at least throughout the history of film media, as long as we've had it, film reflects reality. It reflects what we want reality to be, and sometimes it reflects what reality really is. Either way, film can let us look back on these times and see just the climate, what people want to see and what people are consuming and what people are creating in a time can be extremely informative as to, you know, the values of that time, the expectations of that time. And I think this does an incredible job. Even films that are not explicitly addressing race are always going to have somehow that context is going to impact them because that context is so ingrained in the time. Like films made now may not deal explicitly with, say, coronavirus or the rise of protests over the past summer or any of the other crazy things that are going on in the world, but looking back, people are going to be able to read the impact of those circumstances on film.
I think the films and even TV shows, it shows how like Black America was slowly integrating into like society. So Imitation of Life, Guess Who's Coming for Dinner, that other train movie, I don't know what it was, but it just kind of puts a spin on how Black America is integrating with the rest of society through these narratives, like I don't know, like being content with, yeah, like okay. So let's take, for example, the man on the train. Um, they had that friendship where he wasn't going to leave him. And with that narrative, it shows that like Black people don't hate white people. And so it just shows like integration in society.
Yeah, and I was also going to add the use of like the I forgot what it's called, but like how Black people were like portrayed in like these very stereotypical, very dark-skinned depictions, and it also kind of like adds to like what was the culture of the time, or like what was the understanding of Black people at the time, or like how society viewed them. It kind of gives the context of America and like whether or not this is still something that is looked down upon, or if this is something that still has some support in society right now. So the use of media in like the film, it informs us of like American society at different times or different snapshots of the time, and the use of it is very important in this film. It was used very well, in my opinion.
There's a great audience comment that I want to call attention to as well about Baldwin's focus on American prosperity at the cost of marginalized folks' lives. And I think you can see that depicted in certain ways in the kind of cheerful depictions of wealthier white people dancing, and right, that's intentional to create this juxtaposition between what Baldwin's seeing and commenting on in the 1960s and and then what people are seeing in movies at the same time, right, as a kind of distraction from the day-to-day realities of strife. Sydney, at the beginning, you mentioned revisiting some of Baldwin's written work, and we find out at the beginning of the film that it's going to incorporate this unpublished manuscript where Baldwin was thinking about trying to tell a larger story about U.S. history through the prism of the assassinations of three people that he knew well. And I'm wondering more broadly for folks what they made of, we have clips of Baldwin speaking in forums in the Dick Cavett show where he's eloquently taking down the philosopher, or in Cambridge debate settings where he is surrounded by young white students. But I'm thinking here about the incorporation of his written work as part of the narration that you hear from Samuel L. Jackson's voice. What do you all make of the use of his written work in this documentary?
I think it really plays into Baldwin's characterizes himself in the film as a witness and seems to take on this duty to see these things, record these things, and share these things. And he says that there's a line between being a witness and being an activist. I can't remember the exact word he uses, but being a witness and directly acting. And I feel like he's not giving himself quite enough credit, because I think in witnessing and in sharing what you witness and spreading that information, he is acting. Even now, he didn't directly create this film, but the things that he witnessed and recorded are being used to create this grander thing and this to pass on this message. So I think there's a real beauty in the use of his written works in this way. It's like in the end, he sort of did create the movie. It wasn't exactly the movie he was planning, but his words formed it nonetheless.
Seems to me to be particularly poignant that this film was built off of an unfinished work, and the film itself then shows how much unfinished work there is remaining, right? And Baldwin is this presence in 2020, long after his life, right? There's a great question from the audience about interpreting the scene where white politicians are repeatedly apologizing. How do y'all interpret that and the inclusion of that in this work?
So yeah, that actually was one of the scenes that I noticed quite a lot. It was very striking because to me, the scene kind of represents just the continued apologies that come from white politicians who may or may not be a part of the same systems of oppression that still perpetuate racism today. And to me, it's kind of just it didn't really mean much to me, because it's you're just apologizing. We need to see you do more than that. We need to see maybe some policies or reparations or some other kind of material benefit that will help Black people in society who are still suffering who are still poor or like anything else instead of just apologizing. So it's just like the scene of like apologies, it just didn't really mean much to me because you need to do more than that.
Yeah, I agree with you, Christian. I was kind of like, um, I don't know, it rubbed me the wrong way because it made me feel as though like it's easy for you to apologize and then still do sneaky stuff behind closed doors. And as you can see, this has been going on for a long while where politicians have made plenty of promises or said something very callous, apologized, and continued on about their business. And it's white men. White men are in charge of this country. So until it's somebody else in power who's apologizing, you really can't take anything coming out of their mouth serious.
Let's switch gears a little bit here, and I'm curious what you all think about the way that the film handles Baldwin's sexuality.
I guess I'll jump in. I so I knew that there was a rumor before I watched the documentary, and me personally, I didn't really like how they kind of addressed it by typing it out and just kind of like glazing over it. I kind of felt like it was a little disrespectful, um, because he, in his own sense, didn't address it, and I felt like it shouldn't have been addressed in the documentary. But that's just me personally.
Yeah, I agree that if you're going to bring it up for a purpose. I think, it's great that Baldwin is this, figure who has all of these writings that can be studied through the lens of queer theory, and he has, he's got this great role model for all these people who came after him in that movement. But the focus of this documentary is not, Baldwin's status or impact on the queer movement. It's about his, impact on racial equality movements. So if you're going to bring his sexuality into it, I think you should connect it somehow rather than just kind of throwing it in there like, oh yeah, by the way.
So I would say, my reading of it is that, and it did seem like a kind of a half measure to
Oh dear.
Okay, I guess he'll get back on in a minute.
Is the stream still working? I have it open in another window and I'm not quite seeing movement.
Um, I hope so. Um, my co-associate hasn't really said anything, so I'm assuming it's still working.
Okay, we have gotten confirmation in the chat that the stream is in fact working.
Okay. Okay, there we go.
Can you all hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, I'm sorry about that.
Oh, you're fine.
My computer and internet connection must just be worn down. Um, it just cut out there. And I was attempting a kind of sad defense of the inclusion of that information. I think because it was, my understanding is that sort of the rumor of Baldwin's sexuality and somebody like Bayard Rustin, who was a major organizer of the March on Washington, that kind of information was used as sort of compromising information by the FBI and to sort of threaten the status and standing of folks like that, and it led to Rustin's marginalization as a very public figure. There's a documentary about a relatively recent documentary about Rustin on that very topic. But it does seem like kind of a half measure where it gets tossed out there very briefly and then not really followed up on at all. We have talked about the point about Baldwin serving as a witness and talking about his role as a witness rather than an actor. And I thought that the film did a good job of characterizing that. I turned to some reviews for us.
Okay, we do have a question from the audience, so I guess we can focus on that until he clears up his like Wi-Fi or whatever. So someone asked, Baldwin mentions the celebration of captivity in America. What do you think he means by this?
I think, I don't know, it's an interesting phrase. assuming at least in part, some of that connotation is that America as a nation unignorably was built by the institution of the labor of enslaved people. And even now, as was discussed in 13th, which I believe we watched earlier in this series, there is still this prison industry in America that so much of the profit of the country is based off of that labor. So I think there is sort of a normalization and an excusal of captivity and benefiting off of the labor of people in captivity in America, both then and now.
Hey, we were just addressing one of the questions from the audience, but you can feel free to go back to one of your questions.
Oh no.
I think you froze again. Okay, let me see if I have any questions.
I can jump in on the captivity question.
Okay.
So this is an interesting question because when I think of the celebration of captivity, I also think of the normalization in which people legitimize the punitive way of which society imprisons people or like penalizes people against like certain laws that they see are legitimate, despite society not really taking crime in a way that's like a directive, like this is a public health crisis, like you should be taking crime as a public health crisis, and instead of like trying to like imprison people and like punishing people or like just being super punitive about it, that doesn't really solve the issue. That doesn't really solve the root causes of like why people are getting thrown into jail or like why we have these certain social ills in society. So I guess if I'm understanding the celebration of captivity, I see them that way. And I also see it in the ways in which American society is like, what's the word? I guess I'll just use normalized again. Like they're normalized to ignore like the oppression in society, like racial oppression, class conflict, and other forms of oppression happening in society. Because this is like it is what it is. That's what some people say. It is what it is. You can't change the way society is right now, and they kind of just scoff at people and label them as like radical people in order to this or to that. This is too fast. But these are kind of the people that are like trying to solve the problems in society. So I guess that's another way I probably see the celebration of captivity in the way in which people are like normalized to not really like certain days or can ignore certain topics in society willingly.
I feel like the term celebration is a very like a very vindictive way to really like encompass Black America. Um, the celebration of captivity. And what I think he means by this is like we are oppressed and America really thrives on that. It's not really like yeah, it's a celebration for them because they're able to feed up, like have good energy from our suffering. Um, I mean, it's always been like that, where they just been able to party on the hands of Black people.
Yeah, definitely. I think that it may be a kind of an interpretation on like mass incarceration in the US for sure, but like also in media, um, people kind of celebrate, like you see white people in media celebrating and thriving, and then and black people kind of are inferior to that and kind of held captive in a way where we aren't really free and we aren't as liberated as our white counterparts. But just on the subject of people being mass incarcerated in America, it's like people, America kind of thrives off of that, and it's very normalized. We don't even think, I mean, now I feel like it's coming more to the forefront, but like we used to didn't really think twice about it. People like the mass incarceration numbers in America is just like whatever. Like, so I think that that might be touching on that.
There's definitely a reluctance of the people up top to address the root issues that lead to the crimes which lead to incarceration. It's like, we'll just deal with them once the crimes happen and then profit off of their imprisonment. No, we don't need to fix the communities and the class disparities that lead to these crimes. It's fine. Just don't think about it.
I agree. I think we're gonna close up here, but before we do that, I just was curious on like everyone's lasting impressions of the film. If you had any like closing thoughts that you wanted to um, present here, um, what would those be?
I guess some of my closing thoughts with this film is to also kind of just remember how American society has been set up at the beginning with these systems of oppression ever since the start of like colonialism, when it came to like what happened to the indigenous people and how they drove them off the land and what happened to them. And it's not just happened with the indigenous people, but we also see this with slavery and also what's happening in ICE with the immigration detention centers. And I know this film didn't directly like state that in particular, but it's like we must recognize that oppression happens all around us in many different forms, and it can manifest in ways that are either covert or overt, such as a transition to like mass incarceration and how that was more of a covert way of like racism, and it's kind of normalized to be like a good thing, and that's not really a good thing, and like we should be aware of that in society, aware of those processes happening in society, and like James Baldwin say, we should be witnesses to society and all that is happening all around us.
I think for me, this film really just drives home the importance of educating yourself and educating others. Just, every time I think that I mean, I don't think that I've learned all there is to know, but every time I think, oh, it's cool, I'm a good ally, I'm learning things. And then I watch one of these films and I learned so many things and see so many perspectives that I hadn't seen before or didn't know before. And if there was a way to sit every person down and make them watch all of these films, I think that it's so, so important to educate yourself. And watching films like these is not the only way, but it's one way to do that.
I consider this documentary like a form of art that that once again expresses, like the Black identity. Um, I really have to appreciate watching it in the first place because once again, even like um, even for myself, it opened up some insight that I've never really tapped into on a day-to-day routine and just being like who I am in Arkansas and in America. Um, I mean, I just think it's important. I mean, I think it's important, especially during this time, to like recognize what can you really contribute to, you know, this whole racial situation, and it doesn't even have to be through politics, like he said, Baldwin. I mean, um, there's a lot more that I want to say, but I'm blanking right now. But that's just kind of the gist of it.
Okay, it looks like Dr. Hancock has returned. Um, I can't really see him. Oh, there he is.
I'm really sorry. I can't believe this has happened, and I'm in a different part of the house now, and I have to apologize in advance because you might hear a crying puppy that's going down for the night. And I apologize in advance if this cuts out again. I can't believe it's come up now. So I've tried twice to read some commentary from a film review from the New York Times. And so A.O. Scott said that this is a thrilling introduction to Baldwin's work, a remedial course in American history, and an advanced seminar in racial politics. A concise, roughly 90-minute movie with the scope and impact of a 10-hour miniseries or a literary doorstop. And we talked a little bit about editing and the way that the editing of the film facilitates this intensity, but allows the viewer to move in and out of moments of intensity. But how does it manage to pack all that in? How is it the equivalent of, how does it have the impact and scope of a 10-hour miniseries or a literary doorstop for a 90-minute documentary?
So I know, in my opinion, I know one of the best things that this film tackles is it defines racism in America as systemic and as like across generations. It defines as this is something that happens across many generations and has affected Black people across families, across more families and stuff like that. And it kind of points out one thing I noticed when it comes to how race and race relations are usually taught in school, or like in my experience in high school, it kind of goes away from these grand narratives of, with the civil rights movement, that we had these specific key Black leaders that have fought against racism, and it labels like the racists as like bad people. Like you can't be a good person if you're racist. And it kind of, the film pushes back against like those narratives of racism existing almost everywhere, and it doesn't really like discriminate in a way. It just pushes back against the grand narratives in education, where we learn racism and slavery and the civil rights movement in one way, and then in the film it's more expansive while not taking too much time to really understand everything. So.
And Christian, I appreciate.
Okay, I think he froze again. So I think we have to close because it's been over an hour now. Um, and I'll just make sure to get in contact with him later. Um, so I think this has been a really great discussion. I'm so thankful to have, been a part of it to get more insight. I kind of look at this film in a new light now. So thank you all for being a part of this, Christian, Zakia, and Sydney. It was really great. Um, for people listening, I'd like to kind of advertise that our last film in the Black Representation Matters series will be this same time in 2 weeks. It'll be Moonlight, directed by Barry Jenkins. I'm pretty sure it's Barry Jenkins. And it will also be a discussion panel following that. So make sure you guys tune into that. And that is all for tonight. Thanks for everyone participating. I really appreciate it.